My husband died asking me where the children were, and I lied for the last time in 54 years of marriage, saying they were in the hallway when the truth was that one was closing a deal in Singapore and the other was relaxing at a luxury spa while I held his cold hand alone until his last breath. My name is Dorothy Brennan. I'm 79 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that absence hurts infinitely more than death, and that you can spend 5 decades building a family only to discover too late that you were building alone. On the morning of Harold's funeral, wearing the black dress he had complimented 30 years earlier at a cousin's wedding, my hands were shaking so badly as I tried to close the zipper that I had to sit on the edge of the bed and take 3 deep breaths before I could stand up. The phone buzzed at 7:23 in the morning, and for a second my heart jumped with the idiotic hope that it was Marcus saying he was on his way, that the flight had been delayed but he'd make it in time, that he wouldn't let his mother bury his father alone. Instead, the message was short, efficient, without a single emoji or hesitant ellipses. Mom, client emergency in Singapore, flight leaves in 2 hours. Dad would understand. Business is business. We'll visit the grave next month. Love you. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves and say something different, something human, but they remained there on the screen, cold and practical, like a corporate memo. Marcus had always been like that, even as a child, organizing toys by color and size, crying when something was out of place, growing into a man for whom everything had a price and a schedule, including his own father's funeral. I put the phone back on the nightstand and looked in the mirror, seeing not my reflection, but my mother's, a woman I had sworn never to become, a woman who gave everything and received crumbs wrapped in excuses. Harold had been dead for only 3 days, but it felt like 3 years, 3 decades, as if time had stretched and warped since the moment the heart monitor beeped for the last time in that hospital room that smelled of cheap disinfectant and broken promises. I had spent 11 nights sleeping in an uncomfortable chair next to his bed, listening to his irregular breathing, holding his hand when he woke up confused in the middle of the night, wiping his mouth when the morphine made him too dizzy to eat on his own. On the 10th night, at 3:47 in the morning, he opened his eyes and looked at me with that momentary clarity that sometimes appeared between waves of pain and medication. Dot, where are the kids? Did they come? My heart broke in a new way, a way I didn't even know was possible. And for the first time in more than half a century of absolute honesty between us, I lied. They're in the cafeteria, honey. They'll be right back. He smiled, satisfied, and went back to sleep, while I cried silently, biting my hand to keep from making noise, because even in that moment, I was still protecting everyone, except myself. Marcus had visited once, 45 minutes on a Tuesday between meetings, checking his watch every 5 minutes, saying generic things about how strong Dad was, how he would get through this, completely ignoring what the doctors had already told us. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 3 months at most, more likely 6 weeks. Lauren, not even that. Just quick phone calls where I heard traffic noise or background music, her saying she was thinking of us, sending positive energy, that she'd visit as soon as things calmed down at work, as if death waited for schedules to clear. Harold never complained about their absence, at least not out loud, but I saw it in his eyes when he looked at the door every time he heard footsteps in the hallway, hope lighting up and fading, until he stopped looking. I arrived at the funeral chapel 40 minutes early, because punctuality was something Harold valued above almost everything, and even dead, I couldn't disappoint him. The funeral director, a middle-aged man with a perpetually worried expression, looked at me and then at the empty chairs with visible discomfort. "Mrs. Brennan, would you like us to wait a few more minutes? Sometimes traffic?" I said no, that we could start, that Harold hated delays even in life, and certainly wouldn't want to start eternity waiting for people who wouldn't come. The flowers were too bright, the casket too polished, everything too perfect for a man who lived simply and honestly, working with his hands, fixing things, planting rose bushes in the garden that were now dying along with him, as if they knew there was no longer a reason to bloom. The pastor was young, didn't know Harold, read generic psalms in a monotone voice, and I found myself thinking how different it would be if Marcus were there to tell stories about his father, or if Lauren could read that poem Harold loved about stars and memory. But he wasn't, so there wasn't, and the funeral of a man who lived 77 full years was reduced to 20 minutes of hollow words and 6 people in the audience, none of them blood family, just polite neighbors and the owner of the grocery store where he bought his newspaper every Sunday. During the final prayer, my phone buzzed in my purse pocket, and by terrible instinct, I grabbed it to see if it was one of the kids saying they were arriving, that the car broke down, but they were almost there, anything that would make that loneliness hurt less. It was an Instagram notification. Lauren Brennan posted a new story. My fingers trembled on the screen, a voice in my head screaming not to open it, but I opened it anyway, because pain seeks confirmation, and there it was. My 48-year-old daughter in a white spa robe, green face mask, champagne glass in hand, wide, carefree smile. The caption said, "Self-Care Sunday. Sometimes you just need to disconnect and recharge. Wellness journey, mental health matters." The tagged location, Mi Amo Spa, Sedona, Arizona, $850 a night. Reservations made 3 months in advance. She wasn't stuck in traffic, she wasn't sick, she wasn't in any emergency that justified missing her own father's funeral. She had simply chosen to take care of her nails and drink champagne while I threw dirt on his casket. I put the phone away slowly, with mechanical movements, because if I did it too fast or felt too much, I would fall apart right there in the middle of the chapel. And Harold didn't deserve that. He deserved dignity even in the absence of everyone who should have loved him enough to show up. The burial was even worse, cold October winds cutting through my thin coat, heavy gray sky threatening rain, and me standing alone beside the hole while strangers lowered the casket with ropes. An old cemetery worker watched from a distance, leaning on a shovel, probably used to empty funerals, to people who die alone after living surrounded. When the pastor murmured the last words and offered me the shovel to throw the first portion of dirt, my legs almost didn't support me, but I took it, threw it, heard the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood, and thought, 54 years together, and no one but me to say goodbye. I drove home slowly, in no hurry, because hurry for what? To arrive at an empty house where silence screamed louder than any noise? His recliner was untouched, his slippers side by side as he always left them. The remote control on the coffee table exactly where he placed it the last time before going to the hospital and never coming back. I opened a bottle of wine, not just any one, but that expensive one from the cabinet I saved for special occasions. And I thought about the bitter irony of finally drinking it alone, because there was no one left to share it with. The phone stayed silent the rest of the day. No condolence calls, no messages asking how I was. And when night fell completely and the house went dark, except for the kitchen light, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I opened the drawer Harold kept locked, the one he called important documents. And inside, I found not just insurance papers and deeds, but something more devastating, a yellowed folder labeled family in his handwriting. And inside, 27 years of documented sacrifices in receipts, canceled checks, bank transfers. $18,500 in 1997 for Marcus's apartment down payment, $32,000 in 2003 for Lauren's small and intimate wedding that had 200 guests and lobster, $47,000 in 2008 for Marcus's revolutionary startup that went bankrupt in 9 months. The list continued page after page, year after year, a meticulous record of every time I had said yes when I should have said no, every time Harold and I tightened our belts so they could loosen theirs. At the bottom of the folder, hidden behind all the receipts, was an envelope with my name written in Harold's trembling hand, the irregular letters of someone already very ill. And when I opened it and read the words he had left, words about freeing myself, about stopping giving to those who don't value it, about how Cole was the only one who really understood what love meant, I knew with absolute certainty that what I felt wasn't anger. It was clarity. I picked up the phone, dialed a number Harold had mentioned months before, and when it went to lawyer Rebecca Torres's voicemail, my voice was firm, without tears, without hesitation. "Rebecca, this is Dorothy Brennan, Harold's widow. I need to see you Monday morning first thing. It's about my will, and it's not negotiable." I hung up, and looked out the window at the dead rose bushes in the garden, thinking about how some things need to die completely before something new can grow. And it was exactly at that moment that I decided my children had received their last crumb of my life. The truth is, the signs were always there, small and insistent like leaks in a roof you ignore until the day the ceiling collapses. But when you're inside a family, when you're the mother, the wife, the one who keeps everything running, you learn not to see what you don't want to face. Marcus was 10 years old when I first noticed that calculated coldness in his eyes. Not a normal child's tantrum, but something different. Something that reminded me of boys at school who pulled wings off butterflies just to see what would happen. We were at the park. He had just pushed a smaller girl off the swing because she was taking too long with her turn. And when I asked him to apologize, he looked at me with a completely empty expression and said, "Why? She'll forget tomorrow." Harold saw it too. I know he saw it by the way his hand squeezed mine on the way back home. But neither of us said anything out loud, because parents don't want to believe their children can be cruel by nature. They prefer to believe it's just a phase. Lauren was different. At least that's what I told myself for years. She was sweet and affectionate when she was little, always bringing me flowers she picked from the neighbor's garden, always telling me I was the prettiest mom in the world. But there was something performative about it, something I could only name decades later, as if she were constantly testing which version of herself received more applause, more attention, more reward. At 7 years old, she learned that crying prettily worked better than screaming, that long hugs canceled punishments, that "I love you, Mommy," said at the right moment could turn no into yes. Harold used to laugh and say she'd be an actress, but it wasn't acting. It was something deeper and more disturbing. It was someone learning from an early age that relationships are transactions and love is currency. The years went by and I drowned in diapers, bottles, school meetings, birthdays, always running, always tired, working part-time as a secretary and full-time as mother, wife, housekeeper, driver, nurse, psychologist, bank. Harold worked as hard as I did, heavy carpentry that left his hands calloused and back aching. But he always came home and asked about my day before talking about his, always washed the dinner dishes while I put the kids to bed, always hugged me from behind while I folded laundry and whispered thank you as if I were doing a favor and not simply living the life we built together. I loved that man with an intensity that sometimes scared me, loved the way he fixed broken things with infinite patience, how he planted rose bushes every wedding anniversary, how he never raised his voice, but when he spoke, everyone listened because his words had weight. Marcus went to college on a full scholarship. Intelligence was never his problem. It was empathy that was lacking. And I thought maybe distance and maturity would soften those sharp edges, make him understand the world didn't revolve around his needs. Instead, college just taught him to package the coldness better, dress it in expensive suits and corporate jargon, transform "I don't care about you" into "we need to optimize our family time." He called once a month, 10-minute conversations where I asked all the questions and he gave one-word answers, always with traffic or office noise in the background, always ending with, "Gotta go, Mom, important meeting." And I always said, "Okay, honey, love you," even knowing he had already hung up before I finished the sentence. Lauren followed a different path, married young to a guy Harold never liked but who had family money, had Cole at 22, divorced at 25, when she discovered money doesn't buy fidelity. She came back home for 6 months, bringing my grandson, who was 3 years old, with huge, scared eyes, and they were the best 6 months in years because I finally had someone small in the house who looked at me with pure love, without calculation, without agenda. Cole and Harold fell in love with each other immediately, spent hours in the garden, Harold teaching him to plant, to water, to have patience with things that grow slowly, and I saw my husband relax in a way he didn't relax with his own children, as if he had finally found someone who understood that love doesn't need to be complicated. But Lauren met another man, this one with even more money, and suddenly she needed the apartment back, needed to reestablish independence, needed $18,000 for new furniture, because first impression matters, Mom. You don't understand how networking works at this level. Harold and I argued for the first time in years, he thinking we were being used, me defending that mothers help daughters, that it was temporary, that she would pay it back. He looked at me with deep sadness and said only, "Dot, you're teaching her that using you works." But I didn't want to listen, gave her the money, and Lauren left taking Cole and leaving a hole in the house that never completely closed. The visits became rare. There was always some excuse, work, trip, social commitment, and when they came, it was obvious it was obligation, not desire. Cole running to hug us, while Lauren checked her phone and sighed loudly every time Harold tried to make conversation. Marcus married at 30 to Meredith, an elegant and cold woman who smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes, and the wedding was exactly as I expected, small and expensive, at an exclusive vineyard where each guest cost $200 a head and we paid half without being consulted. During the father of the groom speech, the traditional moment where you talk about love and family, Marcus looked at me from across the room with an expression that wasn't gratitude or affection. It was simply checking, confirming I was there, fulfilling my role, proving I was a reliable mother who shows up when summoned. Harold squeezed my hand under the table so hard it left a mark, and when we returned to the hotel that night, he finally said out loud what we'd been avoiding for years. "Our children don't love us, Dot. They tolerate us, and only because we're still useful." I cried all night, not because I disagreed, but because hearing it out loud made it impossible to keep pretending. And the next morning Harold hugged me and apologized for being cruel, but I said it wasn't cruelty, it was honesty. And honesty is sometimes the only form of love left when everything else has been wasted. We decided that weekend that we would protect ourselves, establish boundaries, stop being an emotional and financial bank for adults who never learned to stand on their own. But then Marcus called saying his startup needed urgent investment, that it was a unique opportunity, that he would multiply the money and return double. And I looked at Harold and he looked at me, and we both knew I would give the money, because mothers can't simply give up even when they should. $47,000 later, the startup failed. Marcus didn't apologize, just said, "Entrepreneurship is risk, Mom. You knew that when you invested," as if I were a partner and not a desperate mother wanting to believe my son still had some decency. Harold didn't say, "I told you so," just became quieter, spent more time in the garden, and I started noticing white strands that weren't there before, a curvature in his shoulders that wasn't from age, but from weight. And I wondered how many times a heart can break before it simply stops working. Lauren asked for less money, but in more manipulative ways. Tearful calls about how hard it was to be a single mother even though she had generous alimony. How Cole needed things she couldn't afford, even though she drove a new BMW. And always ended with, "You're the only one who understands me, Mom, the only one who really loves me." And I fell for it every time, because what mother can say no to a daughter's tears, even knowing it's theater? Cole grew up half lost between two worlds. His mother's fake and shiny world, full of appearances and superficiality, and the simple, honest world Harold tried to show him on the weekends we managed to have him with us. And it was obvious which world he preferred, but also obvious he had no choice. At 15, he asked me if it was normal for a mother to forget his birthday 3 years in a row. And I didn't know what to answer, because yes, it was normal for Lauren, but it shouldn't be normal for any mother. And in that moment, I saw in his eyes the same confusion I felt, the same painful questioning about why the people who should love us best were exactly the ones who hurt us most. Harold heard the conversation from the kitchen, and later came to find me in the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and said something I never forgot. "Dot, that boy is our last chance to do something right in this family. We can't let him get lost too." The following years were strange. Marcus disappeared even more. Calls stopped completely. Just text messages on birthdays and Christmas, generic phrases he probably copied and pasted. And when we tried to visit him, there was always an excuse, work, trip, house renovation, anything but admitting he simply didn't want to see us. Lauren maintained contact, but only when she needed something. Cole's parties where we were invited last minute, financial emergencies that were never really emergencies, and slowly I began to understand that Harold had been right years ago, that we weren't parents to them. We were resources, and when resources run out or stop being useful, they're discarded without ceremony. I started keeping the receipts. I don't really know why. Maybe because numbers don't lie like people lie. Maybe because I needed tangible proof that I wasn't imagining the exploitation. And Harold did the same, wrote everything down in a little notebook he hid in the drawer, amounts, dates, broken promises, as if he were documenting a slow crime being committed against us. When Harold was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I called Marcus and Lauren right away, and their reactions told me everything I needed to know about what kind of people they had become. Marcus asked about prognosis and treatment in a clinical tone, without emotion, as if analyzing a bad investment. And when I said it was 3 months, maybe 6 weeks, he was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped, until he finally said, "Okay, keep me informed," and hung up. Lauren cried, but it was the wrong kind of crying, the performative crying she always did. And when I offered that she come visit us, she said, "Of course, Mom, as soon as I reorganize my schedule." And I knew she wouldn't come, that he would die without seeing his daughter. And I also knew I wouldn't beg, because begging for love from those who should give it freely is a humiliation I didn't deserve anymore. The 11 nights in the hospital were the loneliest of my life. Kind nurses bringing bad coffee and thin blankets, tired doctors explaining things I didn't want to understand, and Harold wasting away in front of me, losing weight, losing color, losing the battle we knew from the beginning was impossible to win. On the 11th night, a few hours before he left, he opened his eyes and looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in days, held my hand with surprising strength for someone so weak, and whispered, "You promise? Promise you'll stop giving everything of yourself to people who only know how to take?" I promised, crying, and he smiled, relaxed, and closed his eyes for the last time, and I held his hand until it was completely cold, until the kind nurse gently touched my shoulder and said it was time to let him go, and even then I didn't want to let go, because letting go meant being completely alone in a world where my own children wouldn't even show up to say goodbye to the man who gave them life. The Monday after the funeral dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning where the world seems to have lost all colors, and I woke up at 5 in the morning, not because the alarm went off, but because my body simply couldn't pretend that sleeping was possible anymore. I showered on autopilot, put on black slacks and a white blouse as if I were going to a job interview. And in fact, I was. It was an interview for the version of myself who would finally stop being an emotional doormat for people who never deserved my devotion. Lawyer Rebecca Torres's office was in an old building downtown, 3rd floor without an elevator, and each step I climbed seemed heavier than the previous one, not from physical tiredness, but from the weight of being about to do something irreversible, something that would forever transform the family dynamic I had spent 5 decades trying to hold together with duct tape and denial. Rebecca was a woman in her 50s, short gray hair, thick-framed glasses, and that kind of presence that makes you feel simultaneously safe and exposed, as if she could see through all your polite lies straight to the ugly truth underneath. She offered me coffee, which I accepted just to have something to hold with my trembling hands, and before I could start with nervous preambles, she said directly, "Harold called me 3 months ago, Dorothy. He told me about the situation with your children, asked me to prepare documents in case you decided to make changes. He knew this day might come." I felt like someone had kicked my chest. Harold had predicted all of this, had known me well enough to know I would need a path already prepared, because alone I might never have the courage to take the first step. Rebecca opened a brown folder and pushed documents across the desk, the original will Harold and I had made years ago, where everything was divided equally between Marcus and Lauren. House valued at $780,000. Summer house in Cannon Beach worth $420,000. Investments totaling $340,000 after all the emergencies that drained our retirement by half. She let me look at the numbers in silence, let me feel the weight of how many years of work Harold and I had invested to build something solid, something that should be a legacy of love but had become a consolation prize for children who didn't even show up to say goodbye to the man who made it all possible. "What do you want to do, Dorothy?" Rebecca asked gently, and I took a deep breath, thought of Harold making me promise, thought of the 11 nights alone in the hospital, thought of the spa post and the Singapore message, and said in a voice that no longer trembled, "I want to remove Marcus and Lauren completely. Everything goes to coal." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Rebecca just nodded, as if she had expected exactly that answer, and began explaining the process. irrevocable trust that would protect Cole from any attempt by his parents to manipulate or control the money, legal structure that would ensure that even if Marcus and Lauren tried to contest, which she guaranteed they would have no basis because I was in perfect mental state, had documented reasons, and most importantly, it was my absolute right to decide what to do with what Harold and I built together. We spent 3 hours in that office, signing papers, initialing clauses, building a legal wall around the only person in the family who had demonstrated real capacity for unconditional love. And when I finally left there, past noon, sun trying to break through the clouds without much success, I felt strangely light, as if I had finally put down a backpack I'd been carrying for decades. I went home, and for the first time in weeks, I managed to eat something substantial, made a simple omelet that Harold used to make on Sundays, ate slowly at the kitchen table, looking at the garden where his rose bushes were bare and dormant, but not dead, just waiting for spring that would eventually come. The phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Unknown number I almost didn't answer, but I did, and it was Cole, voice choked with tears. "Grandma Dot? I just found out. About Grandpa Harold. Why didn't anyone tell me he had died?" My heart broke in a new way, because of course Lauren hadn't told her own son. Of course she had thought it more important to maintain appearances at the spa than to give the boy a chance to say goodbye to the grandfather he loved more than anyone in the world. "Honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "it wasn't your fault. You had no way of knowing." But he was sobbing now, that kind of crying that comes from a deep, primitive place, crying of loss, but also of betrayal, realizing for the first time that his mother was capable of calculated cruelty. He showed up at my door 40 minutes later, probably driving too fast, eyes red and swollen, and when I opened the door, he simply collapsed in my arms, a 21-year-old boy crying like a child, and we stood there in the entryway for what seemed like forever, me holding him and him holding me, two orphans of different kinds trying to find comfort in each other. When we finally managed to move inside, we sat on the couch where Harold used to sit, and Cole told me his mother had only said that Grandpa was resting and they would visit at Thanksgiving. No mention of terminal illness, no indication of urgency. And when he saw my simple Facebook post announcing the death, he had called Lauren furious, demanding an explanation, and she had only said, "I thought it was better not to worry you during your final exams," as if grief could wait for academic convenience. I told Cole about the empty funeral, about Marcus's text and Lauren's Instagram, about the 11 nights alone in the hospital, and I saw something change in his face, that residual innocence children maintain about their parents until the day they finally see them as they really are. "Grandma," he said slowly, "I always knew my mom was complicated, but this is monstrous." I didn't disagree because I couldn't. It was monstrous. It was cruel. It was everything I had spent years trying not to admit about my own children, because admitting meant accepting that maybe I had fundamentally failed as a mother, or worse, that maybe some people are simply born without real capacity for empathy, and there's no amount of maternal love that fixes that. Cole stayed late, helped make dinner, washed dishes, sat with me in the comfortable silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every second with words. And when he finally left, promising to come back on the weekend, I realized that this was the kind of relationship Harold and I had always hoped to have with our children, but never had. The next morning, Lauren showed up without warning, entering with the key I had given years ago for emergencies. And the emergency apparently was her having found out through Cole about the changes to the will. She was different, not the mask of loving daughter she used to wear, but something harder, more real, uglier. "Is it true?" She practically spat the words. "You're cutting us out of the inheritance? After everything we've done for you?" I was watering Harold's orchids, those delicate ones he cared for with infinite patience, and I didn't stop, didn't turn around, just said calmly, "What exactly have you done for me, Lauren? I would genuinely like to know." She started listing things, occasional calls, rare visits, birthday cards she didn't even sign personally, and each item on her list only confirmed how distorted her view of functional relationships was. I finally turned to her, hose still in hand, and said what I had swallowed for decades. You were in Sedona, at the spa, posting selfies while I buried your father alone. Her face turned red, not from shame, but from anger at being caught, at someone finally pointing out the obvious she thought she had hidden so well. I needed that trip, she yelled. For my mental health. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. And something inside me, something that had been silent and polite for too long, simply broke. You want to talk about pressure, Lauren? Let's talk about working 2 jobs to pay for your piano lessons. About sleeping 4 hours a night so you could have a comfortable childhood. About every sacrifice your father and I made while you learned that love is a commodity and family is a resource to be exploited. She was silent for exactly 3 seconds before starting to cry. But it wasn't real crying. It was strategic crying, the kind she always used to manipulate situations in her favor. Crocodile tears designed to make me feel guilty and back down. So this is punishment? She sobbed dramatically. You're punishing us? And I said the most liberating thing I had ever said in my life. No, dear, this is consequence. There's a huge difference. Punishment comes from anger. Consequence comes from clarity. And I'm finally seeing everything with crystal clarity. She looked at me as if I had grown a second head, as if the mother she could always manipulate had been replaced by a stranger who no longer accepted theater. And then she grabbed her purse, muttered something about lawyers, and left slamming the door with force that made the orchids tremble on the shelves. 2 hours later, Marcus called. First time in months he had initiated contact, and his voice had that controlled quality of an executive in a difficult meeting. Mother, we need to talk about this irrational situation you've created. Irrational, he said, as if I were a child having a tantrum and not a 79-year-old woman finally establishing boundaries I should have established decades ago. I tried to explain, calmly, about the funeral, about the absence, about the years of giving without receiving, but he interrupted me with, Mother, you're clearly in a vulnerable emotional state after losing Dad. Perhaps we should consider a competency evaluation before you make important financial decisions. The absolute audacity of it, the calculated coldness of threatening to question my sanity because I finally had the courage to say no, left me speechless for a long moment, and then I laughed for real for the first time since Harold died, because it was absurdly predictable that Marcus would respond with corporate threats instead of any kind of self-reflection. Marcus, I said when I could stop laughing, you missed your father's funeral because you had a meeting in Singapore. Your sister missed it because she was at a luxury spa. Neither of you called, neither of you sent flowers, neither of you showed genuine remorse. And now you want to question my sanity? He went quiet, and in that silence I could hear him recalculating, trying to find a different angle of attack. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed slightly, trying guilt tactics now that intimidation had failed. Mother, I know I made mistakes, but we're your family. Do you really want to spend your last years alone, without children, without grandchildren, without anyone? And that veiled threat of abandonment he thought would be devastating actually freed me completely, because it made me realize they had already abandoned me years ago. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Marcus, I said finally, I have Cole. I have neighbors who showed up at the funeral when you didn't. I have memories of 54 years with a man who truly loved me. I'm not alone. You are. And I hung up before he could respond, blocked his number and Lauren's, and felt something extraordinary, something I hadn't felt completely in years. Peace. It wasn't happy or triumphant peace, it was tired peace of someone who finally stopped swimming against the current and decided to float, let the river take her wherever it was going, because anywhere was better than continuing to drown in expectations that would never be met. That night, for the first time since Harold died, I slept through the night, without waking up at 3 a.m. with anxiety gnawing at my stomach. And when I woke up the next morning, sun finally breaking through the persistent clouds, I knew I had crossed something fundamental, had crossed an invisible line between who I always was and who I could finally become. The following days dragged like an open wound that won't heal, each morning waking to the reality that Harold was dead and my children were alive, but might as well be dead for all they cared. And for the first time in my life, I completely understood why people simply give up, why they look at the pill bottle in the cabinet and think, it would be so easy, so quiet, so final. It wasn't active suicidal thinking, not yet. It was more like passive recognition that existing had become work too hard, and I was too tired to continue making the effort. The house that had been a refuge full of memories had transformed into a mausoleum, each room screaming Harold's absence, his recliner forever empty, his slippers I couldn't throw away, his smell slowly disappearing from the clothes in the closet, no matter how many times I buried my face in them, trying to capture last traces. Cole tried to visit when he could, bringing food I pretended to eat, sitting with me in uncomfortable silences, because what can a 21-year-old boy say to a grandmother who just lost her husband and cut her own children from her life? He was sweet, genuinely worried, but I saw the fear in his eyes, fear of finding me one day fallen on the floor or worse, and that fear of his made me feel guilty for adding more weight to young shoulders that already carried trauma of having a narcissistic mother and dysfunctional family. One afternoon, he suggested I see a therapist, said he had friends whose grandparents had found it helpful after losing spouses, and I agreed just to make him feel better, knowing therapy doesn't fix a hole the size of 54 years of lost partnership combined with betrayal by children you gave birth to and nursed and raised with every drop of energy you had. The therapist was named Dr. Susan Chen, a middle-aged Asian woman with a soft voice and eyes that had seen much worse than my pain. And in the first session, she let me talk without interruption for 40 minutes, while I poured everything out, the cancer, the hospital, the empty funeral, the folder of receipts, the changes to the will, and when I finally stopped, exhausted and without tears, because I had cried so much my body seemed to have forgotten how, she said something completely unexpected. "Dorothy, you're grieving 3 deaths. The death of your husband, the death of the illusion about your children, and the death of who you thought you were as a mother. That's triple grief. Don't be surprised you're devastated." Those words, that simple validation that my pain was proportional to the loss, made something break inside me, and I cried in her office like I hadn't cried since Harold stopped breathing. Ugly, deep crying that came from a primitive place where words don't exist. But therapy sessions once a week didn't fill the other 167 hours, didn't stop the intrusive thoughts at 3 a.m. when the house was too quiet, and my mind started spiraling, calculating how many pills were in the cabinet, if it would be enough, if it would be fast, if anyone would miss me, or if Cole would simply find me days later when he came to check and carry guilt for the rest of his life. I stopped answering the phone, stopped checking email, stopped doing anything beyond the absolutely necessary to continue technically alive. And even that started to seem like an optional effort. Neighbor Martha knocked on the door several times, bringing homemade food and genuine concern. But I pretended not to be home because I didn't have energy to explain, to smile politely, to pretend I was dealing well, when in reality I was sinking fast. Marcus hired a lawyer not to contest the will because Rebecca had guaranteed that would be useless, but to pressure me psychologically, formal letters arriving demanding family mediation and independent geriatric evaluation, legal language designed to make me feel incompetent and senile when in reality I was more lucid than I had been in decades. Lauren tried a different approach, started a social media campaign, vague posts about broken families and bitter mothers, and importance of forgiveness, never naming me directly, but leaving it clear enough for anyone who knew the situation. Comments from her friends expressing solidarity with everything you're going through, as if she were the victim and not the perpetrator. Cole showed me the posts, and I saw fury in his eyes that mirrored what Harold would have felt. But I just felt empty, as if I had reached a point beyond anger or pain where only gray numbness existed. The truth is, I began to understand my mother in ways I never had before. My mother who died when I was 30, alone in a cheap nursing home because none of her 5 children could handle taking care of her. My mother I visited once a month with heavy guilt, but not enough to change anything. My mother who looked at me on the last day and said, "Don't let them do to you what they did to me." And I had promised I wouldn't, but I had let exactly the same thing happen because generational patterns are like DNA. They pass invisibly until the day you look in the mirror and see your mother looking back. Harold had broken that pattern in his own family, had maintained healthy distance from toxic parents without guilt. But I never could, always thought love meant infinite sacrifice, that being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left. And now I was discovering too late that a good mother actually establishes boundaries and teaches children to be functional adults instead of dependent and selfish adults. One particularly bad night, 2 weeks after blocking Marcus and Lauren, I was sitting in the dark kitchen at 2 a.m. with a bottle of Ambien the doctor had prescribed for insomnia, counting pills, doing morbid math of how many would be enough versus how many would be too many to seem like an accident. I wasn't decided. I was just considering, weighing options as if deciding between 2 flavors of ice cream and not between continuing to exist or not. I opened the bottle. 12 blue pills rolled into my palm. I knew exactly how many were too many. Harold had told me, in his last days, when the pain was unbearable and he considered, no, I couldn't do this to Cole, couldn't let him find me. The phone rang, startling me so much I almost dropped the bottle, and it was Cole, worried voice. Grandma, I know it's late, but I had a strange feeling. Are you okay? And something about that simple question, about a 21-year-old having intuition that maybe I wasn't safe alone with my thoughts, made me completely fall apart, admit for the first time out loud that no, I wasn't okay. I was very far from okay. I was in that dark place where people don't come back from if they don't have a rope to pull them back. He showed up 20 minutes later, must have broken every traffic law, found me still sitting in the kitchen with the bottle in my hand, and without saying a word, he simply sat next to me, gently took the bottle, put it in his pocket, and held my hand while I cried one more time, cried for Harold, for me, for his mother who didn't deserve to have a daughter so emotionally broken she considered leaving her grandson orphaned of grandmother too. You can't leave me, he finally whispered, voice breaking. You're all I have left of real family. If you go, I'm completely alone with them. And that perspective, the idea of abandoning Cole to the same fate I had, of leaving him to navigate alone in a family of narcissists without anyone who really loved him, was what finally penetrated the suicidal fog and made me realize I didn't have the luxury of giving up, because I still had responsibility, still had purpose, still had someone who needed me in a real way and not a transactional one. Cole stayed that night, slept on the couch with one eye open probably, and the next morning he made coffee the way Harold used to make it, strong and black, and we sat at the table in silence while sun rose slowly over Portland, painting the sky pink and gold, indifferent to human drama happening beneath it. Grandma, Cole said finally, I know you lost Grandpa Harold, but I'm still here, and I know I'm not a substitute, but I love you, for real. Not because you give me things or help me financially, but because you're you, and the world would be an infinitely worse place without you in it. We cried together then, not crying of despair, but crying of connection, reminding each other that family isn't always shared blood. Sometimes it's shared choice. It's showing up when no one else shows up. It's holding hands when everything is falling apart. Dr. Chen intensified our sessions to twice a week, added antidepressant medication I had resisted because people of my generation don't believe in happy pills, but which I finally accepted because I wanted to live to see Cole graduate, marry, have children I could love the way I always wanted to love my own children, but never completely could. The medication didn't magically fix anything. I still had days where getting out of bed seemed impossible, where the weight of existing was too heavy, but it took the sharpest edge off the darkness, created a small space between suicidal thought and suicidal action, and in that space I slowly began to rebuild something resembling a will to continue. Martha finally caught me one morning when I was checking the mail, and instead of letting me run away, she simply hugged me on the sidewalk, a long hug that didn't require words or explanations. And when she finally let go, she said only, "You're not alone, Dorothy. I know it feels like you are, but you're not." Marcus's lawyer sent more papers, this time threatening to publicly expose reverse elder abuse, where children are victims of vindictive parents, an absurdity so complete I laughed when I read it. But Rebecca assured me it was just empty intimidation, that they had no case, that my will was solid and my mind provably competent. Lauren tried one last attack, showing up with Cole without warning, clearly hoping to use her son as an emotional shield. But Cole refused to participate in the manipulation, told his mother in front of me that she needed to accept consequences of her own actions and stop trying to recruit him for a war she herself had started. Seeing my grandson, so young but already more emotionally mature than my 48-year-old daughter, defending me against his own mother, was a simultaneously sad and proud moment. Confirmation that at least one person in the next generation had learned that real love requires presence, not performance. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I began to come back, not to who I was before because that person was dead along with Harold, but to someone new, someone stronger in some ways and more fragile in others, someone who had looked at the abyss and decided to take a step back instead of a step forward. I went back to watering Harold's orchids, not because he needed me to water them, but because they were still alive and deserved care, even though the original gardener had departed. I went back to answering the phone when Martha called. We started having coffee together every Thursday, she sharing her own story of having cut a toxic brother from her life decades ago, normalizing my decision in a way therapy alone couldn't. And on an April afternoon when the first rose began to bud in Harold's garden, a stubborn little red bud emerging from a branch I was sure was dead, I understood that survival sometimes isn't about blooming immediately. It's about simply not dying during winter, about keeping roots alive below the surface until spring eventually comes, as it always does, even when you're sure it won't. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in May, a yellowed envelope I hadn't seen in Harold's drawer, hidden behind insurance papers and old deeds. And when I opened it and saw the date, 3 days before he died, my breathing stopped completely, because he had written it in his last moments of lucidity, had used precious energy not for himself, but to leave me a final message. "My dear Dot," it began in a trembling handwriting that barely looked like his. "If you're reading this, it means I've departed, and you're alone now, as I feared you would be, because I know our children better than they think I know them." I sat on the edge of the bed we shared for more than 5 decades and read each word slowly, savoring, memorizing, as if it were the last conversation we would ever have, because it was. He wrote about how we didn't fail as parents in the traditional sense, but we failed in loving too much, in believing too much, in continuing to give when we should have stopped, and that my only job now was to live for myself, not for them, not for his memory, but for Dorothy, who had been buried under layers of duty and sacrifice. "The money that's left," he wrote, "leave it for those who know the value of what we built. Cole understands. He always understood. And Dot, please, dance. Like you danced in the kitchen when you thought no one was watching. I was always watching, and I always loved it." I cried reading that. Not the crying of despair that had consumed me for weeks, but crying of recognition, of being completely seen by someone who knew me on a level no one else ever would. And also crying of regret for all the times I didn't dance because I had laundry to do, or bills to pay, or children to satisfy. Harold had given me final permission to be selfish, to choose my peace over the false harmony of family, and I carried that permission in his handwriting like it was sacred scripture, because in a way it was. I placed the letter in a frame next to our photo on the 40th anniversary, both of us smiling in the garden surrounded by red rose bushes he planted with his own hands, and something inside me that was broken began slowly to reorganize itself into a different shape, not fixed, but reassembled into a mosaic where the cracks were part of the design. "Doctor." Chen noticed the change in the next session, the way I sat more upright, how my voice had recovered something of firmness that had been absent. And when I told her about the letter, she nodded in that way therapists have when a client finally has a breakthrough they were gently guiding toward but couldn't force. "Dorothy," she said, "you've spent your life being defined by relationships. Harold's wife, Marcus and Lauren's mother, Cole's grandmother. Who is Dorothy when you remove all those labels?" The question caught me off guard, because honestly I didn't know. I had been a wife since 19, a mother since 22, had built my entire identity around caring for others, And now that Harold was dead and children were cut off, who exactly was I? The session ended without an answer, but the question lodged itself in my brain like a seed, something to cultivate slowly until it began to sprout. Cole and I started a project together, renovating the summer house in Cannon Beach that had been abandoned for years. A place where Harold and I used to take the kids when they were little before they decided they were too old for corny family vacations. Cole had surprising skills with carpentry, had learned by watching his grandfather in the summers he spent with us, and working side by side sanding old wood and painting walls was therapy better than any formal session could be. We talked while we worked, not about heavy things, just about life, about his plans after college, about the girlfriend he was starting to get serious with, and for the first time in months, I felt something like purpose, as if I were building something tangible instead of just surviving day after day. "You know, Grandma," he said one afternoon while we were fixing the rotted deck, "I was thinking that when we finish here, we could rent the place in the summer to families who can't afford normal vacations. Like Grandpa Harold's legacy. He always said joy should be shared." The idea touched me deeply, transforming a place of broken family memories into a place where other families could make happy memories. And more than that, doing something that honored Harold's values of genuine generosity, not the performative generosity Marcus and Lauren practiced when they posted about charity while treating their own family like an inconvenience. We decided right there that we would do exactly that, would create a small foundation in Harold's name, use part of the investment income to subsidize summer vacations for low-income families. Let his real legacy be about practical love and not monetary inheritance for people who didn't value where it came from. Rebecca helped me set up the legal structure, at no cost, because she said she had been moved by the story and wanted to contribute to the good I was trying to put in the world. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt not just surviving, but really living, creating something positive from pain instead of just sinking into it. Martha convinced me to join her group, Widows Who Won't Be Silenced, 6 women of varying ages who all lost husbands and were navigating life alone. And the first meeting was a revelation, because I realized my story wasn't unique. All of us had versions of absent children or complicated families or regrets about how much we gave of ourselves. One woman named Patricia had cut all 3 sons from her life 5 years ago after years of financial and emotional abuse, and another, Joyce, had lost her husband traumatically and discovered her daughter was having an affair with his doctor. Hearing these stories didn't make my pain smaller, but it made it less isolated, less shameful, less like personal failure, and more like a tragic but recognizable pattern of dysfunctional family relationships that happen more frequently than society likes to admit. We started meeting every first Wednesday of the month, bringing wine and food and raw honesty that's only possible between people who no longer have energy for social masks. I went back to painting, a hobby I had abandoned 30 years ago, when Marcus was a baby, and free time became a mythological concept, bought watercolors and small canvases, and spent entire afternoons in the garden trying to capture Portland's specific light, the way it filters through persistent clouds, creating a soft, melancholic glow. I wasn't good. The strokes were amateurish, and colors sometimes came out muddy. But it didn't matter, because I was creating something that existed only for my own pleasure, not to impress anyone or fulfill some function, just for the simple joy of seeing color spread on white. Cole framed my first completed painting, a scene of Harold's garden with blooming rose bushes, and hung it on his living room wall, saying it was his favorite work of art, and that pure validation, without agenda, without expectation of reciprocity, made me understand the difference between being valued and being useful, a distinction that had escaped me during decades of transactional relationships with my own children. In June, 6 months after the funeral, I woke up one morning and realized I had slept through the night without waking in panic, that I had dreamed something neutral instead of the recurring nightmare of being alone in the cemetery, screaming for help that never came. I made coffee, sat on the back deck watching birds at the feeder Harold had installed years ago, and for the first time in half a year, I felt something like contentment, not exuberant happiness, but peaceful quietness of accepting that life had changed irrevocably, but hadn't necessarily ended. Martha came over for our usual Thursday coffee, bringing fresh scones. And while we talked about nothing important, gardening and weather and benign neighborhood gossip, I realized I was laughing, genuine laughter that came from a real place. And Martha noticed too, smiled and said, "Look at that, you're coming back." And I realized she was right. I was coming back, but to a different place. Not to who I was before, but to who I had potential to become when I finally stopped living for others. Expectations. Marcus tried one last time, a long, elaborate email that had clearly been reviewed by his therapist or lawyer, talking about cycles of hurt and importance of forgiveness and generational responsibility to break patterns. But he didn't mention the funeral once, didn't apologize for not showing up, didn't acknowledge the specific pain he and Lauren had caused. It was just an abstract exercise in rhetoric, designed to make me feel guilty without him having to admit specific guilt. I started writing a detailed response, pointing out each logical flaw and emotional manipulation. But halfway through, I realized I was giving energy he didn't deserve, that the better response was silence. So I deleted everything and blocked his email too, adding a final layer of protection around the fragile peace I was building. Lauren stopped posting about the situation on social media when she realized she was just looking bad to her friends, who started asking uncomfortable questions about why exactly she hadn't gone to her father's funeral. And Cole told me she had even sought therapy, not from genuine recognition of problems, but because her recent divorce was getting ugly, and she needed to seem mentally stable for a custody battle that didn't even exist because Cole was already an adult. On my 80th birthday in August, Cole organized a small surprise. Just Martha, the widow group, some close neighbors. Rebecca even showed up bringing an expensive bottle of wine, and we sang Happy Birthday in the garden surrounded by rose bushes that had finally returned to blooming after a year of dormancy, as if they too had needed time to process Harold's loss. I blew out the candles and didn't make a wish because I already had everything I needed in that moment. People who genuinely cared, renewed purpose, peace that came from healthy boundaries. And when Cole hugged me and whispered, "Grandpa Harold would be so proud of you," I knew he was right. Harold would be proud not because I had been strong in the dramatic sense, but because I had been strong in the harder sense, had chosen to keep living when it would have been easier to give up, had chosen to build new meaning when old meaning had crumbled. That night, after everyone left, I put on music Harold loved, that scratched vinyl that skipped every third line but had charm exactly because of the imperfections. And I danced alone in the living room as he had asked in the letter, and for the first time I didn't feel alone dancing. I felt him there with me, not literally, but in his memory living in me, guiding my steps even absent. And I knew finally that I was going to be okay, not overnight, not without scars, but eventually, inevitably, I would find my way back to something like joy. Autumn arrived, bringing that fresh Oregon air that smells of new beginnings and wet leaves, and with it came clarity about what needed to happen next, not just surviving or existing, but really living intentionally and deliberately, building a life that honored Harold's memory without being defined only by his absence. Cole and I finished the summer house renovation in October, transforming a place that had been abandoned and forgotten into a welcoming refuge full of natural light and recovered wood. And the first family that received a subsidized stay was a single mother with 3 small children who had never seen the ocean. And when she sent me a photo of the children running on the beach with huge smiles, I cried good tears for the first time in almost a year, tears of fulfilled purpose instead of endless pain. We created a small photo album in the house, blank pages where each family could paste memories and write thanks, and slowly those pages filled with life, tangible evidence that something good was growing from the ashes of everything that had burned. Rebecca called me in November with news I expected but still caught me by surprise. Marcus had officially given up any legal contest. His lawyer had finally convinced him he was wasting money pursuing a case that had no chance of winning. And Lauren apparently had resigned herself too, at least legally, although Cole told me she still talked badly about me to anyone who would listen, painting a narrative where she was a devoted daughter, rejected by a cruel and irrational mother. The part of me that used to care what other people thought was slightly disturbed by this, but the new version of me that was emerging simply shrugged because people who really knew me knew the truth, and people who didn't know me, their opinion didn't affect my reality in any way. "It's over," Rebecca said with satisfaction in her voice. "You're officially free of them legally, and Cole's trust is shielded from any future interference. But legal freedom doesn't automatically mean emotional freedom, and there were still moments, usually at 3 a.m. when defenses were low, where I questioned if I had done the right thing, if I had been too harsh, if my children, despite everything, still deserved chances I was no longer willing to give. Dr. Chen reminded me in those sessions that doubt doesn't mean the decision was wrong. It just means I'm human, and humans feel complicated things about complicated situations, that I can simultaneously know that cutting them was necessary for my survival and still feel sadness about the family that could have been if they had made different choices. "You're not the villain in this story," she repeated when I needed to hear it. "You're a survivor who finally put an oxygen mask on herself after spending decades making sure everyone around her could breathe while you suffocated." Martha introduced me to a book club that met at an independent bookstore downtown every second Monday of the month. And initially I resisted because what does an 80-year-old woman have to offer literary discussions with people half her age? But I went anyway, and discovered that age was completely irrelevant when you had life perspective and willingness to engage honestly with ideas. We read everything, from contemporary fiction to memoirs to nonfiction about psychology and relationships, and the discussions were rich and varied, and for the first time in decades, my brain was being intellectually stimulated instead of just processing an infinite list of domestic tasks and family dramas. One of the women in the group, a retired teacher named Diane, became a close friend, and we started meeting for lunch between club meetings, talking about books but also about life. And she shared her own story of having distanced herself from a toxic sister who constantly tried to borrow money and never returned it, validating once again that establishing boundaries with family wasn't moral failure but survival necessity. Cole graduated in December with honors in mechanical engineering, and I was in the front row of the ceremony, heart exploding with pride when they called his name and he crossed the stage to receive his diploma. And later, during the celebration at a restaurant I insisted on paying for, he made a toast not just to academic achievements, but to my grandmother Dorothy, the strongest woman I know, who taught me that real love shows up especially when it's difficult. Lauren was supposedly in town and could have gone. Marcus was supposedly too busy with work, and their absence at Cole's graduation was their choice to make and their consequences to live with. And I no longer felt the need to make excuses or fill the gaps they left. Cole had a gallery full of people who really cared, and that was enough. His girlfriend, Sarah, a sweet girl studying veterinary medicine, hugged me and said, "Mrs. Brennan, Cole talks about you all the time. You clearly had an enormous impact on who he became." And in that moment, I realized that legacy isn't about how many children you raise, but about the quality of love you manage to transmit to the next generation. January brought rare snow to Portland, covering the city in silent white that made everything seem new and clean. And I woke up one morning and decided to do something I had been putting off for months, completely clean out Harold's closet, donate his clothes to institutions that could use them, stop maintaining a shrine for a person who was no longer physically present. Cole offered to help, but I said I needed to do it alone, and it was a slow emotional process, each shirt carrying a specific memory, the one he wore on our 50th anniversary, the one he stained with paint when we painted baby Cole's room, the one that smelled like smoke after he saved photos from the neighbor's house fire. I kept some pieces I couldn't donate, his winter coat that still vaguely smelled like him, a sweater he wore every Thursday when we watched our shows together. But most went into carefully labeled boxes, and when I finished, the closet was half empty, but didn't feel empty. It felt like space intentionally created for a new phase of life. I started ballroom dancing classes in February, something I had wanted to do when I was young, but never had time or money or permission from myself to be so frivolous. And the first class was embarrassing and clumsy because an 80-year-old body doesn't move like a 20-year-old body. But the instructor was patient, and other students were encouraging, and there was something deeply liberating about learning a new skill without pressure to be perfect or useful, just for the pure pleasure of movement and music. Harold had loved to dance when we were young, before life got too heavy with responsibilities and fatigue, and spinning in that dance studio every Thursday night felt like keeping a promise I made to him in that letter, to keep dancing even though he was no longer there to lead me. My regular dance partner was a gentle widower named Frank. No romantic interest on either side, but easy companionship of two people navigating life alone after decades of partnership. And we talked between numbers about complicated children and permanent losses and small joys of rebuilding identity in old age. Martha convinced me to volunteer at the local food bank once a week, and initially I thought I was too old or too fragile for physical work. But they put me at a sorting station, organizing donations, and there was something meditative about the repetitive work serving a clear purpose. Sorting cans, checking expiration dates, assembling boxes for families in need. I met people from all walks of life volunteering, retired executives working alongside college students, all united by a desire to do something tangible to help. And the informal conversations during work exposed me to perspectives and stories that expanded a world that had become too small during years of focusing only on dysfunctional family. One woman I regularly helped, a young mother of two struggling to leave an abusive relationship, reminded me of myself decades ago, except her prison was a violent husband instead of manipulative children. And when she finally got the courage to leave and start over, I gave her the key to the summer house for a full month, saying she and the children needed a safe place to breathe and heal, and the gratitude on her face was more valuable payment than any money could buy. Cole surprised me in March, announcing his engagement to Sarah, and when he showed me the ring he had chosen, simple but elegant, exactly the type she would have loved, I knew Harold would have adored that boy, would have recognized in him the kind of man who thinks about his partner's preferences instead of just making a big performative gesture. "Grandma," he said nervously, "I know it's weird to ask this considering everything that happened with my mom, but would you be willing to help Sarah and me plan the wedding? Not financially, just your presence and wisdom." I held his hand and said it would be an absolute honor, that building a celebration of real love was exactly the kind of project Harold would approve of, and we started planning a small, intimate wedding for September. Just 50 people who really mattered, in the garden Harold had planted, surrounded by rose bushes that now bloomed abundantly. Sarah asked me to do a reading during the ceremony, a poem Harold and I had at our wedding about love being a daily choice and not just a feeling. And when I accepted, I realized I was finally healing in a way that allowed me to participate in joy without the paralyzing pain of his absence. Spring brought literal and metaphorical renewal, the garden exploding in colors I had forgotten existed during the gray winter of grief. And I spent hours kneeling in the earth doing work Harold used to do, planting bulbs and pruning dead branches and talking to him out loud. Because when you're alone in the garden, there's no one to judge if you talk to the dead or not. Neighbors commented on how beautiful the garden was, better even than when Harold was alive. And I knew it wasn't technically true, but appreciated the sentiment, understood they were really saying, "You survived, you're blooming again, you transformed something sad into something beautiful." Patricia from the widow group told me at a meeting that I had changed since she first met me a year ago, that there was light in my eyes that wasn't there before. And when I asked what she thought caused the change, she smiled and said, "You stopped waiting for permission to be happy. You simply decided to be." Rebecca called me in June with final news. Marcus had moved to London on a work transfer, cutting the last remaining geographic ties, and Lauren had remarried, third marriage, this time to a man 20 years older who had enough money to keep her in the style she considered necessary. Cole had been informed of both changes via text, no invitation to Marcus's farewell dinner or to Lauren's wedding. And when he told me his voice was more resigned than hurt, acceptance of someone who finally understood relationships with his parents were transactional and superficial, and probably always would be. "You know, Grandma," he said, "I used to hope my mom would change, that she'd wake up one day and realize what she was missing. But I think some people just don't have the capacity for love that other people have. And that's not about me or about you. It's about them." His wisdom, so young but already understanding what took me 8 decades to learn, filled me simultaneously with sadness for what he had lost and pride for the person he had become despite it. And it was exactly at that moment, with this new clarity about family patterns, that I received the call. Marcus, after 2 years of absolute silence. My hand trembled over the ringing phone. I stared at his name on the screen for 3 rings, 4, 5, remembering everything, the funeral, the hospital, the years of giving. And then I did something I had never done before. I declined the call. I didn't block it, didn't delete it, just let it go to voicemail. And when the notification appeared that he had left a message, I didn't listen to it. Not that day, not that week, not ever. Because some doors, once closed, should stay closed. And I had finally learned that protecting my peace wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Cole and Sarah's wedding happened on a perfect September afternoon. Impossible blue sky without a single cloud. The kind of day Harold used to call a gift straight from the universe. And the garden was exploding with colors. Red rose bushes he planted decades ago, now mature and abundant, forming a natural backdrop for the most beautiful ceremony I ever witnessed. 50 white chairs arranged in a semicircle, each decorated with simple ribbon and wildflowers, Sarah and I had picked the morning before, and when the bride appeared in the dress we chose together, vintage lace that belonged to her grandmother, I felt Harold there with me so intensely, I almost turned to comment with him, before remembering he wasn't physically present, although in all the ways that mattered, he was. Cole cried when he saw Sarah walking toward him, cried openly without shame. The kind of emotional vulnerability Harold had modeled, and Marcus never learned. And when they exchanged vows, they wrote personally, promising to show up for each other, especially when it was difficult, promising to build a family based on presence and not performance. I knew the cycle was finally broken. During the reception, Cole made a toast that caught me completely off guard, raised his champagne glass and said, "I want to thank my grandmother Dorothy, who taught me the difference between blood family and chosen family, who showed me that true love shows up, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when it hurts, especially when no one else is watching." His voice broke slightly, but he continued, "Grandpa Harold isn't here physically, but his legacy is in every rose in this garden, in every lesson Grandma Dot passed to me, in every choice I make to be a present man instead of an absent man. And Mom, my dad, if by chance you're hearing this from afar, know that I forgive you for not being here today, just as I forgive you for not being there on so many other important days. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean giving more chances. It simply means letting go and moving forward with people who choose to stay." The silence that followed was profound, 50 people processing the raw courage of those words. And then Sarah kissed him, and everyone applauded, and the moment passed, but the impact remained. Marcus hadn't sent even a card. Lauren sent a generic gift clearly bought by an assistant, an expensive vase without a personal card, the kind of gift that says, "I fulfilled social obligation," without saying anything about real love. And Cole donated it to a charity bazaar, without a second thought. Their absence at the wedding was noted, of course. People asked politely where the groom's parents were, but Cole had a prepared answer, simple and honest. "We're estranged. It happens." And people generally didn't press because anyone who's lived long enough understands families are complicated and not all stories have Hallmark-type happy endings. What mattered was that the people who were present, Martha and the widow group, Rebecca bringing a generous honeymoon fund gift, neighbors who had followed the entire journey, teacher Diane from book club, even Dr. Chen showed up, forming a community of chosen love that proved family isn't always who shares your DNA, but who chooses to share your life. I danced at that reception, not just one dance, but several, first with Cole in the traditional grandmother-grandson dance, where he led me gently and whispered, "I love you," in my ear. Then with Frank, my class partner, who made me spin and laugh. Then even with Dr. Chen, who admitted she didn't know how to dance but tried anyway. And when I finally sat down, feet hurting but heart full, Martha sat next to me and said, "Harold would be so proud of you, Dot. You took something broken and transformed it into something beautiful." I couldn't respond immediately because emotion closed my throat, but eventually I said, "It wasn't just me. It was all of you, too. You held me when I was falling. And it was true. No one survives trauma alone. No one rebuilds without community. And I had been lucky to find my tribe when I needed it most. In the following months, life established a new rhythm. Not the frenetic rhythm of years raising children, or the heavy rhythm of years caring for a sick husband, but the chosen rhythm of a woman who finally had autonomy over her own time. I woke up when I wanted, not when an alarm commanded, drank coffee, slowly reading the entire newspaper instead of just headlines, spent mornings painting or gardening or simply sitting on the deck watching birds. Afternoons were for social activities, lunches with friends, book club, volunteering at the food bank, dance classes, and nights were mine. I cooked when I felt like it, ate cereal for dinner when I didn't, watched shows Harold and I used to watch together, but now with a different perspective, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman rediscovering her own tastes without having to consider another person's preferences. Cole and Sarah had dinner with me every week, a tradition we established and maintained religiously, and those nights became the anchor of my week, living proof that the choices I made, as painful as they were, had been right. I started writing, not a book or formal memoir, just thoughts and reflections in a notebook Rebecca gave me as a gift, processing the journey I had made from devoted wife and sacrificing mother to independent woman, who finally understood that giving too much of yourself isn't a virtue when people take without gratitude or reciprocity. I wrote a letter to my younger self, that 19-year-old girl marrying as a virgin and full of dreams about the perfect family she would build, telling her that perfect family doesn't exist, but real family does, and real sometimes means letting go of people you gave birth to because they refused to grow up. I wrote a letter to Harold, thanking him for 54 years of real partnership, apologizing for times I didn't listen when he tried to warn me about toxic patterns, promising I was finally living the way he wanted for me. I even wrote a letter to Marcus and Lauren, not to send, but to exercise, saying everything I never said out loud about hurt and disappointment and complicated love that doesn't disappear just because you establish boundaries. And after writing, I burned that specific letter in the garden, watching ashes rise and disappear, literal and symbolic liberation. Dr. Chen and I agreed to reduce sessions to once a month, not because problems had disappeared, but because I had developed tools to deal with them myself. And in our last regular session, she asked me, if you could give advice to other women in your situation, women who gave everything to families that didn't value it, what would you say? I thought for a long time before answering. I would say it's not selfishness to choose your peace. I would say forgiving doesn't mean going back. I would say you can love someone and still decide it's better to love them from afar, where they can't continue hurting you. And I would say it's never too late to start over. That at 80 years old I found more joy and purpose than I had in previous decades because I finally stopped living for other people's expectations and started living for myself. It's not abandonment, it's survival. The first anniversary of Harold's death arrived in April, and instead of spending the day sunk in grief as I feared would happen, I woke up and decided to celebrate his life instead of mourning his death. Cole and Sarah came, and together we planted a new rose bush in the garden, a special variety called Eternal, white and pink flowers the gardener guaranteed would bloom abundantly for decades. We dug the hole together, placed the plant gently, covered the roots with rich soil Harold would have approved of, and Sarah read a poem about love that continues even after death, about how people we love leave permanent impressions on who we become. I didn't cry, or at least not much, because I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful to have had him for all that time, grateful he loved me enough to free me in his letter, grateful that even in death he continued teaching me about living authentically. Martha came later with a cake she made, not a mourning cake, but a celebration cake, and we ate in the garden surrounded by everything Harold and I built together, and I felt him approving, smiling, saying, finally, you're dancing. The summer house in Cannon Beach continued being a refuge for families in need, and we created a small website where people could apply for subsidized stays, telling their stories and reading those applications, seeing the real need of people struggling but trying to give their children happy memories despite difficult circumstances. constantly reminded me of the privilege I had of being able to make a tangible difference in others' lives. One family in particular, a recently widowed mother with a teenage son, wrote to me after the stay saying that week had been the first time in a year she had seen her son smile, that the ocean had done something therapeutic that formal therapy couldn't, and she ended the letter with, "You transformed your pain into a gift for strangers. That's the most beautiful legacy that exists." I kept that letter in the drawer next to Harold's letter, reminders that pain can be transformed, that loss can generate creation, that the end of one story can be the beginning of another. Marcus eventually sent me an email, almost 2 years after the funeral, short and formal. "Mother, I'm engaged. Wedding will be in London in December. Would understand if you didn't want to come." There was no apology for the past, no acknowledgement of pain caused, just practical information and a lukewarm invitation that clearly expected refusal. I responded even more briefly, "Congratulations. Won't be able to attend. Wish you happiness." And that was it. Closure without drama. Final acknowledgement that our lives had diverged completely and permanently, and surprisingly, it didn't hurt like I thought it would. It was just a fact, like observing the season had changed, or a plant hadn't survived winter. Lauren never reached out directly, but Cole mentioned she had asked about me casually. "How's your grandmother?" The kind of question you ask when you know you should care, but don't care enough to really reach out. "Told her you're well," Cole reported. "Better than you've been in years." She didn't say anything after that. Now, sitting in my garden on a spring morning, 3 years after burying Harold alone, watching the rose bushes he planted blooming more abundantly than ever, I finally understand what he tried to teach me throughout our life together, that true love doesn't imprison, it liberates. He freed me to live fully even in his absence, and I freed myself from children who never learned to love without an agenda. And in that freedom, I found not loneliness as I feared, but a rich community of people who choose to be present. Cole and Sarah announced last week they're expecting a baby, my first great-grandchild. And when Cole told me, he said, "Grandma, will you teach us how to be present parents, how to break patterns, how to love unconditionally but still maintain healthy boundaries?" And I promised yes, that everything I learned the hard way I would pass to them in an easier way. That the next generation wouldn't need to learn lessons through pain if I could help it. Today, this morning, before writing this, I danced alone in Harold's garden, barefoot on the wet grass among the blooming rose bushes, without music, just wind and birds. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like I was dancing alone. I felt like I was dancing free. If you're reading this, if you recognized your own story in my words, if you're trapped in a family relationship that drains instead of nurtures, I want you to know, it's not too late. It's not selfish. It's not cruel. It's survival. It's choosing life instead of slow death by 1,000 cuts of neglect and manipulation. You can love someone and still decide you need to love them from a safe distance where they can't continue hurting you. Forgiveness doesn't mean giving more chances. It means releasing bitterness so you can move forward. Not for them, but for you. I was 80 years old when I finally established boundaries I should have established decades before, and even then it wasn't too late. I found joy and purpose and community I didn't know was possible. If I could rebuild at 80, after losing the husband I loved for more than half a century and cutting off children I carried in my body, you can too. The door is there. You just need the courage to turn the handle and walk through it to the life that's waiting on the other side, a life that's truly yours, a life where you're not useful but valued, a life where you don't just survive but flourish.